Hey, everybody out there at LudoNarraCon. Great to have you here. This session is called Game Stories Told in Most Unexpected and Surprising Ways. And we're going to be talking about a lot of interesting game storytelling. It's a lot of interesting games as part of LudoNarraCon that do interesting things with narrative. But we're going to talk about how games can tell stories other than the ways you expect, not always in conversations, not always in cutscenes, but actually, weird different ways. And we've got a really interesting lineup of folks, and I'll have them introduce themselves in a minute. I guess I'll introduce myself first. My name is Richard Rouse. I'm studio creative director at a studio called Farbridge, where we like telling dark and original stories and building some cool worlds for those to take place in. Previously, I'm known for having worked on the Suffering horror games. I worked on the State of Decay franchise while I was at Microsoft, and I shipped an indie game a few years ago called The Church in the Darkness, which you can pick up on sale as part of LudoNarraCon. But I'll just have everybody introduce themselves. So Daniel, do you want to go first?
Okay, I get to go first because I'm leftist in the images okay.
Or so you think.
So yeah, so I think. So I see it the way I see it. So I'm Daniel Benmergui. I am an Argentinian independent game developer. I recently shipped a game called Storyteller, and I am the designer, programmer, like lawyer, like accountant, like PR, office manager, and most stuff at my studio.
Cool. And Richard, who is not me, do you want to go next?
Sure, happy to do it. Hi, I'm Richard Dansky. I spent 23 years at Ubisoft, mainly working as the Central Clancy writer. Now I am with Crytek working on Hunt Showdown.
Cool stuff. And last but not least, we have Latoya. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So, hey, I'm Latoya Peterson. I'm the CXO and co-founder of Glow Up Games that I founded with my friend Mitu. We are the first, as far as we know, all women of color founded game studio. And we did our first title in the world of HBO's Insecure in partnership with HBO and Issa Rae. So that's out on mobile. And we're working on a second kind of live experience, second screen experience for the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and fixing stuff for game too. So that's us.
Awesome. Yeah, and I was like to get all of these speakers in here because they have a lot of experience, working in narrative in games, but also working in narrative in games in sort of unexpected and different ways than you might have seen. So I was speaking of Insecure, the project you all have shipped, Latoya. That was super interesting to me because it was, it's obviously connected to Insecure, the show. And that has this whole, the main character, Issa, who talks to herself in the mirror to sort of hype herself up for things, or sometimes, be your own worst enemy, depending on the situation. But you then implemented that in the game. And I thought it was cool because it was kind of sort of turns it into a music game for a bit, but a music game that's also telling a story at the same time, which I hadn't seen so much. So I'm curious, how you all arrived at that and like what you were going for with sort of putting that into that title.
Absolutely. So, we were huge fans of the franchise before they reached out. They actually reached out to us before we were a studio. It was just me and the two kicking around ideas. And so when we decided we were going to do this, we knew we wanted to play, to make sure that we did justice to the main driving event of the show, which is Issa facing herself in the mirror. And again, as you mentioned, it could be negative or positive. There's a lot of different emotions that come out. So we actually called one of our close friends, Anango, aka Samus, who's a rapper in her own right. We were just kind of like, hey, if we need to produce bars or do something for a game, what would you recommend? What should we do? And we ended up developing the system that we call Rhyme Step. And it was like the first rap rhyme composition mechanic. A lot of rap games are rhythm action. We are all wordsmiths, essentially. Everybody's a storyteller at the studio in some way. And so we kind of made this thing about words. We wanted to be kind of like smarter Mad Libs, for it to feel like you're really an MC. So that took some doing and some refinement. But the process of building Rhyme Step is what ended up kind of shaping the whole narrative focus of the game. And I should mention here, I'm kind of an accidental narrative designer. I didn't necessarily, I didn't join the game studio thinking I'm going to write my first game, like that's what's going to happen. But the nuances of what the show required were really strange and specific. It's like, it's not just being able to write to this rap rhyme system that we created. It's not just being able to write in the world of Insecure, the voice that has to be approved by like the talent on the show, including Issa. That was really tough. But it's also just a very specific kind of Black experience, a specific Black millennial experience. It's a Black millennial LA experience. And over time, I ended up writing it and then getting assistance from like amazing folks like Jordan and like Toya Kristen Finley and Clara Fernandez Vara and all these other really cool people who helped me be like, okay, this is how you make a game out of this dope story that you guys are telling. And so for us, like the key was always one, looking at the musical story we wanted to tell and looking at the ways in which we integrate language from a rap and rhythmic perspective, and also from like the way in which people speak in a contemporary way and the way they spoke on the show. And then the mirror as a portal, which I think we're going to keep exploring in other works since we all liked it so much. And there were so many cool things that we didn't actually implement into the end game that play a lot on what is happening to you when you're looking in the mirror. And so those were like the big influences.
Cool. And as in that game, as you're going around, you're sort of collecting new words that you can then use in the mirror, right? You're sort of like Mad Lib Plus, but like tied into the narrative. Would that be how you would describe like the details of how the system works?
Yeah, so we have it like this one part life sim, right? And then one part technically card capture under the hood, right? And so words are cards, and there's all this stuff that we're doing for refining the system now to make them a little bit better, but they're contextually based. So we had to figure out systems of like, how does the system understand how you are speaking, if something's positive or negative? How do you understand the valence of words? How do we understand word positions? And then how does that work into like the play structure? So there was a lot that we had to figure out from the system side. And then from just like a gameplay side, players really wanted that realness and authenticity of that world. They wanted to feel like they were actually talking to the characters on the show. And so we had to really work on matching tone, balance, style, and making sure that people felt like they were having the same level of the same level of fun, all the different pieces that they liked watching on the show. So it was a significant narrative challenge, but really fun.
Cool. It kind of, so it's interesting to compare with Daniel's game, Storyteller, as he mentioned, just shipped. In that, it's sort of, it's a narrative game, but where the narrative is completely the mechanics of the game too, and sort of how you assemble it. How do you, if nobody's seen Storyteller, Daniel, could you explain, like, how do you explain it to someone just without showing them the trailer or something like that?
Right. So Storyteller is a small puzzle game about building stories. And that's a super tiny description of it. A slightly longer description is that it's a game where you have a comic panels and you have settings and characters, and you place settings and characters into them, and that builds a plot because characters react to each other and what's happening. And you're given a title, like say, A Murder of Jealousy, and you need to build a plot that has murder of jealousy in it, right? Whatever plot works. That's how Storyteller works.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting how, the story, it doesn't really have, maybe I haven't watched or played far enough in it to know, but it seems like the player is sort of generating the stories to solve these challenges, and there's like different ways to put the puzzle together, I think, based on what the player wants to do on the more advanced ones anyway. But there's no real, like, the game itself doesn't have a central story to it, or does it as well?
Oh no, Storyteller is mostly about giving the player the tools to build their own plot. So there is not a central story governing the whole game. It's just mostly it's you and you creating stories, and we didn't want to meddle with that. So it's just the player and his stories. Yeah.
And then how did you originally come up with this idea for this sort of, I'm going to make a story game that doesn't have a story, but the player's going to make the story to solve the sort of challenges? Like, how did that, it's a pretty out there idea, very cool. So I'm sort of curious how that came together.
Yeah, it came together because when I was little, I had these children's storybooks that, they come with text and images and illustrations. And, I know how the story went, right? Because, they've been read to me, or read them myself, so I knew what the stories were about. But looking at the illustrations, I wondered what would happen if I could intervene it somehow, right? What would happen if I warned the main character about what the witch is about to do, right? What could I play around with the witch room to see if there's something important going on besides what the storybook wants to tell me? So I wanted to make a game where you could do that, right? So you have a thing that you have a story that you can intervene. And then I took it like all the way, and it's like, you know what? Let's let people build the whole thing, right? just using characters and settings that are often used in classical stories, right? Like the witch or the throne room, or a graveyard. Those are settings that are commonly used in stories, but here I give them to you as tools that you use to build stories.
Cool. Yeah, no, it's super interesting. I think people into LudoNarraCon should check that out. And speaking of like, there's the game Richard's been working on lately, Hunt Showdown, is sort of an extraction shooter. It's not a genre known for having stories, yet there you are, the narrative director on that title. I believe that's your title. But so how do you find that you're gonna somehow shoehorn narrative into an extraction shooter when there's sort of no obvious place for it?
I don't think we're shoehorning it in there. We're actually using it as a reward for the player. As they gain experience, as they play more, then story is released to them. And so they get a better sense of the world that they're moving around in. We can't do cutscenes. We can't do a lot of the traditional stuff because that's simply not the way the game works. But having the narrative there as something that players can aspire to unlock as they're going forward really, I think, helps deepen the world and gives people some motivation to keep playing.
Cool. Do you find that the because people don't come to it necessarily for story, that getting story as a reward is like a surprise to them, or is it more like, no, I just want to hear about my loot and why is this story in the way?
People seem to be really into the story. The world is deep. We've got a glossary of characters, of monsters, of things that people want to know about. The game is 5 years old and there's a ton of storytelling that's already gone into it. And people really seem to like that. And my job is partially to continue telling those stories in a way that people continue to enjoy.
Cool. Yeah. And do you find that, because it's a matched based thing where you're, getting into a match and then maybe playing multiple times in an evening or over a span of time, and that there's no sort of progression to the story, like on a daily basis, where it's like sort of set in a place, and then does it evolve over time in some way to progress? Is that something that's happened over the last 5 years, or something you're hoping to do in the future?
The story is progressing as how can I put this delicately? The story progresses as we keep on telling it. Maps stay the same, but we are telling a story that is ongoing, and we will see what happens in the future.
Cool. And does the story, like, is the player's role in the story more as like being stuck into the middle of it and then just absorbing the stuff that's happening around them that they're getting about the characters and all that stuff, or do they have a role in the story of some kind as player characters?
They are getting the story told to them. They are not advancing the plot. What they are doing is the hunt, which is the key element of the game, is going out there, shooting those monsters, getting those bounties, and then shooting each other. But the world is there to enrich that experience, to give them a reason to do everything that they're doing in the world.
Cool. Yes, not a place you'd expect to find story. So sort of the definition of our panel here. Yeah, I guess I can say for sort of I was, the indie game that I shipped, The Church in the Darkness, that's in LudoNarraCon. It was something where it sort of starts out as if it's setting up a traditional story, but actually all the storytelling is told sort of more environmentally, and you're stepping into this world with these crazy cult leaders who are talking to you over this public address system as you're trying to infiltrate the South American cult to find your missing nephew. And a lot of players come into the game thinking it's going to have a more traditional story than it does. And then they're in this world where the story is sort of all around them. And part of the game too is that the story changes every time you play. So like whether the cult leaders are more crazy or more helpful to their followers changes. So you try to figure that out and try to figure out if your nephew is safe. And it was interesting that because players sort of expected more of a traditional story in it, they're like, well, where's the story? I don't understand. It's like, well, no, it's sort of going on all around you, and that's what's changing. And the people who are really into it pick up on the changes and the little nuances in what the cult leaders are saying that indicate they're one of the different personalities they can be. But other players are just like, well, this doesn't have as much story as I expected. And you sort of have the opposite with Hunt, where it's like people go into it probably not expecting there to be story, and then when they find that there's a rich world, they sort of get stuck onto it. Do you think that's how that works, Richard?
Absolutely. I think it's value added to have this rich world, this in-depth storytelling, these little arcs of things that are happening in the world that our setting allows for. And it's not the narrative isn't oppressive. It doesn't create ludonarrative dissonance. It's there to be enjoyed as people go forward.
Cool. And to give people something to dress up as when they go to conventions, as fans of the Hunt. So I wanted to open it up a little bit in terms of, we've each, worked on games that have told stories in some unexpected ways, but I'm curious of like other games that people have been inspired by in the past that have told stories in untraditional ways, and sort of things that were, because we all know what traditional game storytelling is like, and it can be done very well and be very effective, but there's a lot of other space to play in terms of storytelling. Does anybody want to go first with an example of a game that was inspirational to them, that had some unexpected storytelling techniques, and talk about that a bit? Maybe LaToya looks like she has one. Maybe do you have one you'd like to bring up, LaToya?
Sure, I guess. Well, remember, I'm fairly newer to games, right? So I was a games writer and critic way back in the day, in the blog world days, so 06 to like 2012. So I used to write about games pretty frequently, but I wasn't making them. I was doing other stuff, and I was in TV.
Well, you can still be inspired by games even if you're not making them at the time. So that's important. Yeah.
And I was just talking about this game today too, in terms of like a thing. I'm like, oh, I aspire to make something similar to this, like that. But what I really loved about one game in particular was Eternal Darkness, which I played for one of the Nintendo systems. It's definitely one of my like most influential games in terms of things I think about play. And there's two reasons for that. One, because it was, before then, I think I was playing mostly like mainstream releases and things that were very, very big. I hadn't discovered indie games in a deep way yet. But I was looking at that release, and it was trying to be a lot more artsy than your traditional game. Like, it opens with a poem, there's all this other stuff that's going on. And there's other games that have done that before, but for me, in terms of like when I first encountered it as a console player, like that was a really big moment. And then the fact that it had a sanity meter that would impact how you perceive the reality of what was happening around you really blew my mind. I love that whole idea. Me and my good friend Matt Bach, who's also a game designer that most people know, he did like the Rock Band hardware and was CB at Harmonix for a long time. But we used to always joke that we're going to make a game about racism, and like it's gonna, and like that sanity meter thing is going to be in there, because it's like, was that a microaggression? Was that on? And like going back and forth between all of these different states that your mind is running through to be like, wait, am I tripping, or is this real? But I always love seeing that in Eternal Darkness, and how like the more traumatic stuff's now, like post-pandemic, I feel like I should revisit this game and replay it again and kind of really let it marinate. So I'm like, the more traumatic events you're exposed to, your sanity meter starts creeping up. You're starting to see a lot more things warp. You're not sure what's happening anymore. And I just felt like that was such a powerful metaphor. And I really loved Christopher Nolan's Memento back when I was like a film student. And I was like, oh, I should do that. And that whole idea of playing with narrative so much so that, you're keeping the audience in the dark, and you're keeping the characters in the dark at the same time around what's actually happening in that piece. Was always one of my favorites, especially knowing that like he shot it for 30 grand over 5 years and like just had to figure out how to make it work. And so when I think about games that do that, there's other games now that I've played as, that do more interesting and I think more risque takes that look at jettisoning narrative all together. There's one game, Merritt Kopas's game, Limb, that I really love, because there's no narrative at all, technically. Like, you're moving the block around and there's other blocks that are coming. But the game starts telling this really powerful story about exclusion and inclusion, insiders and outsiders. And literally, this is like Zelda era, like 8-bit blocks that are just moving across the screen. There is no primary narrative. You just move or you don't move. But the story becomes so powerful that a lot of people start crying, like they freak out when their little block is getting attacked, things like that. So those are the games that kind of inspire me when I'm thinking about, and just I think more broadly too, coming from linear television. Before that, I was a journalist. So you're always crafting the story, and you're always the person that has the lens, and you have the master view, and you're always the one telling the audience how to feel. It's been really freeing in games to step that back and to start thinking about, what are these other altered states I could play in? What are these other pieces that I can think about?
Yeah, and I always loved, thinking of that, like, what are these other tools you can work with, like in Eternal Darkness and the Sanity Meter, and how, they would make you think your TV was messing up, like while you were playing, and it would look like the volume was suddenly going down, and you're like, wait, I'm not touching the volume, and what's going on? And like, it sort of broke the fourth wall, if you will, of like coming out of the game to this meta sanity thing that was like, I hadn't, certainly at that time, sort of more experimental indie games and stuff, was like, what is happening? This is not allowed. Who gave them the permission to mess with me like this? So yeah, no, that's a classic for sure. Daniel, did you have any games that were inspirational to you in terms of doing, because you've got a long history of doing more experimental games, and all the different sort of art game type things you've done in the past? Like, what was driving you as inspiration for you to get into games and then to make something like as different as Storyteller?
Well, I was just thinking, as you asked the question, I was thinking that I cannot think of an example of a game that came to my mind while I was making Storyteller. It's probably I don't know, maybe I made a game that is so far out in what I was trying to do that I didn't actually have any close references. But that said, I definitely there's an influence of this game design school that has been getting more influential these past 10 years, which is this self-taught puzzle games that try to explain themselves to you without words, without talking to you, just by giving you the right amount of stuff so you can come up with the right ideas yourself. So I'm definitely influenced by that, and that made Storyteller harder to do, mostly because I didn't want to rely on text. And I would say also that I have an anti-inspiration, I would say, and that is games like I want to diss David Cage, right? But Heavy Rain was an example of a game that was trying to do something with story that when I first played it, when I first saw it, I was like, this is very expensive, and it's very, I want to explore the story, but it just takes too long to do that, right? Mostly because, he has to do, whenever you make a choice in the game, the animators need to do this guy's shooting, now this kind of dramatic scene, you have to hire actors, a lot of things have to happen for you to get to see the consequences of the decision you just made, right? So I was like, yeah, but I want to do this faster, right? I just want to know what happens. I don't want to go through all the motions when I make a choice, right? So that's one thing that when I was making Storyteller, I was thinking, how can I make a game where you don't have to wait, right? Just go back and change it, and it's snappy, and you can do it right away, right? Which is one of the most novel things that Storyteller does, I think. Is this idea that you can change the story, you can see the outcome without having to tell it across time, right? You just move it across space. It's like, okay, I put this character forward, in a future panel, and I change the future, right? So I changed it in the past, all the future changes with it. So it's all snappy. You can try the stuff right away. So I would say that games that really need an effort to give players the power to play around with the story, I was like, yes, I want to do that, but I want to do it differently, right?
Yeah. No, that's
for 1 sec, because I'm like, Heavy Rain came out in my Games Critic days, and I always thought a lot about like that game, and like Cinema Envy. Max Payne was also in that like genre, right? I'm just like
Cinema Envy.
Super long.
Yeah, so you now you have two people dishing on David Cage.
I mean, but it was interesting because like I don't remember feeling that way about Shenmue, right? And like that game literally took like a year to like go and play through, and I was like, well, today I'm going to the arcade, and like today passed, and I have to go to do this. So I was like, there's definitely something that feels different, I think, when you're like, this is an important story I am trying to tell you right now, versus like, oh, I'm experiencing the story as a player. I just wanted to like stay on that for a second because I was like, oh, he's over here smacking cows. Like, look how he ran. But look, is it? But I mean, we can talk about that later. sorry, Dan.
No, I think that's a great follow-up. I think I refer to that as like my desire for interactions per minute when I'm playing a game. So like I've played some games that I really like the first season of The Walking Dead. I thought was like a super good version of that type of adventure game, branching narrative thing. But my interactions per minute were still incredibly low, right? It was just like, wait for some guy to talk, wait for me to talk, maybe then I get to talk with a choice. I get one interaction. Oh, and then I'm going to watch some people talk for a while. So I've definitely always a little biased to like games where the story's happening around you while I'm still like controlling my thing and can make a bunch of choices, not just one choice and then wait. So I think you're like streamlining that for Storyteller. That's a fascinating way of like, I want to do branching, but not have to wait quite as long and not have the, massive expense of it. And that when I did the indie game, I was talking about before, the Church in the Darkness, that was about, I had been in AAA for a long time and had done a lot of branching narratives in AAA. And there was always like the struggle of like, oh, we want to do a branch here, but that's going to cost this $100,000 to do this branch or whatever, right? And now, oh, well, let's just cut the branch because, do we really need that? Not every player is going to see that content. So is it worth that amount of money? And I was like, well, if I honed down the game to something where it was, a much smaller project, much, infinitely smaller budget than some of the AAA stuff I worked on, was like, I can have a game that has 40 different endings in it, that are kind of combinatorial and work in these weird ways. And people will be able to, go after those, or they'll just get a few of the endings, but there's the possibility space of all these endings. That's what makes it cool, is knowing like I can make choices and get something unique to me, or mostly unique to me, because there's so many choices. And as a result, my game has, no cutscenes, and like the characters are these abstract little low poly figures and the camera's way up here. So it lacks David Cage's cinema flair, but it has some of the storytelling, not as much as Storyteller, but it has a bunch of it. So Richard, I wanted to ask you too about inspirations, about stories told differently in games. You had that long run at Ubi on the Clancy stuff, going from the early ones that felt like a shooter that had, some of a Clancy novel wrapped around it, to like the evolution of how those stories were told up through like Splinter Cell, Conviction, and that sort of stuff. Like when you all were getting inspired for ways to work more and more narrative into the Clancy games, because it seemed to go up over time, were you getting, how were you figuring out what you're getting inspired by to do some of that as that was building over time?
We were really doing a lot of exploring on our own on those more story-driven Clancy games. There wasn't really a lot in that space. I mean, I know there's shooters galore. I know there's AAA shooters galore, but the sort of stories that we were telling with the Clancy games were very different than what you get with some of the other ones. And trying to tell a personal story in a Splinter Cell game, for example, very different from the global spanning stuff you get in a Call of Duty, for example. And
right,
so right. I almost look to more role-playing type games for trying to drive stories that were character driven through those shooter spaces. One of the best things I ever heard was that shooters are actually like musicals, except instead of a dance number, you've got a gunfight. And so that was another place actually to look in terms of timing. Don't tell anybody at Ubisoft I said that, but it's true.
They can't get you anymore. You're good off working on new projects now. But yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but I totally see that point of like, I once heard it compared to like a Barbie fashion designer game is similar to like a wrestling game. It's just in one, you dress up your character and they go on the runway and do their thing, and that's the game. And in the other one, you dress up your character and they go on the runway and then they have a fight at the end of it, and that's the wrestling game version of that. So there's a lot of like analogies to like other mediums as we're bringing in like, well, how would you tell story in this space? Going back to sort of role-playing game stuff, I know you have a past, Richard, in, working on the White Wolf properties, and that was sort of where you got your start before, getting into Clancy stuff. What were the things that inspired you in terms of like, oh, I could tell games through stories instead of just, novels or movies or whatever, that pulled you in, that were key to getting you excited about storytelling in games?
Absolutely. And yes, I do indeed have a past. But I always loved role playing. I started when I was 10, 11 years old, and it came naturally to me that we'd be building these worlds that were designed outward. That the idea of building a world to let players pick stuff up and run and go to their own places was the intention, as opposed to what you get in a lot of video games, which is where you want to close things off so that the fantasy matches the action of the game. And so in my time in tabletop, it was inspiration from all over the place. It was books, it was movies, it was other role-playing games, it was video games. I too am a huge fan of Eternal Darkness. I love the fact that the game lied to you. I love unreliable narrators in gaming. That's one of the things we actually do in Hunt Showdown, where all of our world content is unreliable narrators, and you get to decide what you believe.
Cool. Yeah. Now, how do you, can you go more into that and talk about like how is it because everything is like a document written from someone's point of view or something like that, and that they'll
Exactly. Yeah. Everything's an artifact. Everything's a piece of the world. It's all part of the environment that you're running around in.
And then do you have like, is there a single truth that players will find if they look hard enough, or is it more designed to be never answered exactly what the truth is?
I could tell you that, but then I'd have to kill you, and that takes me back to the Clancy days, and we don't.
All right. You haven't heard it here first. There may or may not be any truth in Hunt the Showdown. Good to know. So I think it's interesting that we've all, experimented with like telling stories in these different sort of unexpected ways in our games. And do we think that's like, because I think there's a lot of ways you can like engage as a creator, in terms of you can just take, I remember there was this great example in Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics of like different types of creators. And some people are, like someone like Harrogate, who did the Tintin books, is just really doing the same thing over and over again, but it's really good. Right. Minus the colonialism. But then you'll have other creators like an Art Spiegelman or something, who's just really like rebooting. Each book he does is like a radically different thing than he did before in terms of style. And, he had success with Mouse, but then didn't do, exactly the same thing for the rest of his career because he just couldn't, right? It just has him as a creator. He did do a second Mouse book, but it wasn't the only thing. He kept doing radical sort of reinventions of comics after that. I guess I'm curious if we all like feel like, I'm curious, Latoya, for example, you mentioned you're bringing some of the ideas of like the mirror and maybe some of the wrapping into future projects, but are you seeing each project like Glow Up does as needing to like reinvent storytelling in a way?
Yeah, and that's to our detriment, to be honest. We're an indie studio broke. Like, what people like is a really something that's really fantastic that can be copied. Like, we got so penalized when we came into the market with the Insecure game. And
when you
like,
say some people, like, you mean like business
investors,
people specifically?
like
Yes,
right. They like a formula, right? And so when you're like, hey, we got this like this life sim, it's like wrap around mechanic, they're like, this is garbage. Like, can you give us like that high heel runner game? Like, and also we're like, do you guys like makeup? Can you do like a makeup game or like a Barbie thing? Like, it's always like something like that. And when you try to tell new stories or do new things, and people also don't know what to come for you for. For us, it's like the bigger brand. We're like, it's Glow Up. Do you love Black and Brown Joy? Do you like diverse storytelling? We're going to bring you that. It'll just be in different forms. And so when we started doing the Oregon Shakespeare Festival project, right, that came out of nowhere. It was a very strange, random occurrence of why we started doing this work. But Nataki Garrett, who's the artistic director over there, the first Black woman in the history of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, like 89 years. She was bringing this very interesting and different influence into adapting Shakespeare. And she was like, oh, can we do something around Romeo and Juliet, which she set in a homeless encampment. And it is very Bay Area, like West Coast influence. And so like and the great like Verona party scene where Romeo and Juliet meet for the first time, which we all know from, you know, any adaptation you can pick a pick. They're playing like Two Shorts, Blow the Whistle, they're playing Gas Pedal, like there's all these different things that made it feel really cultural. And like for us, I'm like, oh, this is a total fit with the things that we do. The Queen Mop speech that Mercutio does, the actor Donna does it as a rap, and they do it almost like a cipher, which is really, really fun. And so we saw places where our gameplay would naturally fit with this world they were building. And so we started building that out. But in terms of, I think, us as a studio, we just like doing different stuff. And it's weird. Like, it would definitely be a lot more sane to just do the same thing, because then you know how it works and you know how to measure it, and you can be like, this is what it is. But as I think artists and creators, right, we're like this weird ragtag group of like rappers, coders. I was a writer and a producer for this. We're always like, well, what's the coolest thing we can think of doing today? So we just talked about like, oh, are we gonna make like a visual novel game next? We're gonna make like a mixed reality game. I don't know. Different people have different skill sets, and so okay, you leave that one, I'll go figure this one out. But yeah, I think from an artist perspective, it's definitely reinvent, because I don't want to keep doing the same things over and over again. But from a market perspective, that's really difficult, because, you know, games are very much commerce tied, and they want to see this was popular, therefore this feels the same and it'll be the same thing, and then this feels the same and it'll feel the same way.
Yeah, I think it is tricky. I like to think of it sometimes as like bands that I follow, like metal bands mostly. They have like an album, you know, that's successful, and then there's like a turning point. Do we make the same album again, or do we make a different game, a different album the next? And then it's like, if it's different the second time and still good, and the fans still come along, then you're in good shape, because then you can keep making different ones going on. If you make 3 albums that are the same, and then the 4th one's different, everyone hates you. You're totally out. So as a company, it's sort of the same thing. It's like looking at a studio like Clay or something, you know, where they make a game and they don't just make Mark of the Ninja forever. They then make Don't Starve, and then they make Oxygen. And so it's like it's a studio that you like because it's doing different things each time, and hopefully, you know, Glow Up sets that stake in the ground. I like that a lot. So Daniel, I'm, you know, you've just shipped Storyteller, so, and you know, we're working on it for a few years. So I don't know if you're thinking about next projects yet, but I'm imagining it's going to be pretty different. Or do you feel like the keywords you've captured for Storyteller on Steam, you want those same keywords to apply to the next game you do as well?
Yeah, I think I haven't been cursed with a hit so far. So that means I don't have to ask myself that question. It's like, can I make Storyteller 2? And I think sure, but I don't think it would be safer than doing something entirely new. Not with. I mean, Storyteller is doing actually pretty good for an indie game. We are surprised. But it's not, you know, hit in that, you know, I need to make, you know, 3 more versions of this before, you know, we run out of that. So, and also, you know, I have this mind in which once I finish something, I really need to put my mind on something completely different. Mm-hmm. And then after I do that, I can come back to the old stuff again, look at it with fresh eyes, and think, oh, I could do this other thing with this idea. And that would be interesting. And I would not have had that idea back when I finished this game, right? So I needed to let some time to let all the ideas and all the thoughts I have about that game simmer. And then after a while, I come back and have fresh ones. So that's part of the reason why Storyteller took so long to make. Storyteller took, if I take the first prototype, like the first version of Storyteller happened 15 years ago. So it's been a very long road. And what happened was that whenever I got stuck, I would do something else for a couple of years, then go back, look at it, and think, oh, I was stuck on this, but this is the answer. It's so obvious now, right? Whereas back at the time, I had no idea how to solve it, and I was suffering. And yeah, so whenever I finish something, I need to put my brain to work on something completely different from what I did before. So my guess is my next game, we're going to keep working on Storyteller for a while though. It's not completely over. We are adding some new stuff that we think is going to make the game better. But then after that, I don't know. Like, I'm excited about that. Like, what is going to happen? Like every project I made was very different. So yeah.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
well, I guess that's the peril of doing something so different too, is not only, does the market not know what to do with it or the investors, but you just, it's hard to make something completely new, like in the way some of y'all's games are, where it's just like, well, this problem hasn't been solved before, and I can't go look at how the other 5 games that did this exact thing did it and pick the one I like the best. Like, which button should I put crouch on? You got a lot of options to pick from if you're working on a shooter. And there's a right answer in the marketplace at some point. Whereas, how do I rearrange backgrounds with characters to tell a new story? It's like, well, gonna have to try stuff, and sometimes it's gonna take a while. And yeah, I guess Richard, you made the change recently, as you mentioned, from going from working on the Clancy stuff to working on something totally different. I'm imagining that feels good to be, working in a pretty different space. Do you think that's, was that a lot of the reason why you made that, just to try something completely new in terms of storytelling, even though there were a lot of differences between the Clancy games you worked on, I recognize?
Yeah, that was very much part of the reason that I made the change. I think that there's great stories to be told in Hunt Showdown. It's a horror game. Horror is near and dear to my heart. I have always been a fan of horror, and so getting to play in that sandbox with monsters in the swamp was a great opportunity for me. And at the risk of sounding cliched, I was a little Clancy'd out, to be honest. There's only so many threats to the world that can be solved by shooting it in the face. I am very proud of the work I did on the Clancy games. I've worked with great teams, great people. We made some fantastic games that people really enjoyed, but it was definitely time for me to move on and try and tell some different stories.
So you're still shooting things in the face. They're just more horror-y things.
Exactly. Well, face, quote unquote, in some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's great to not have that sort of, have some characters the players are playing who are maybe less morally upstanding, or at least pretending to be less morally upstanding. And I mean, have you found the switch in terms of, creatively the problems you're trying to solve with, like, again, a game that doesn't seem like it wants narrative in it and trying to put it in there, it's very different feeling than, like, having a bunch of cutscenes that you progress through and a bunch of missions that the player is going to play the same. Has that been, like, perplexing to you at times as you've been working on these new challenges? And
it's been refreshing, really.
Yeah.
The Hunt's a live game, so the content maw is constantly devouring. There's always need for more story, more characters, more of the world as we go along. And so that is a really refreshing change of pace from these monstrous AAA titles that would take years to lumber their way through development. And it's been, so far, it's been a real pleasure to get on that train and keep running as we're doing much smaller bits of content, but turning it around and getting reaction faster and seeing what people like and what people don't like and being able to adjust.
Yeah, totally. Much different vibe than the big thing that goes in the box at the end. Yeah, and for myself too, I spent a long time working on my indie game, which was very experimental in how it did storytelling and how it, had a changing story, but that changed in such subtle ways that people maybe didn't notice it was changing. So in some of the stuff I've been working on lately, it's like as different as you can get from sort of one big strategy game that we're working on that tells story in some pretty different ways, but it's a pretty linear experience, not a lot of branching, to another project we're working on that's unannounced yet, but is like taking some of the elements of sort of a big open world with story going on in it, but remembering, sometimes you can fall in love with, like, this idea I had of, like, a subtly changing story around you, but realizing sometimes players need a little reminder that the content is there and that they have all these choices to make, depending on how you present the game. So we're trying to meld some of that stuff together. So I think we're just about out of time. I wanted to give everybody a chance to give a shout out to anything where people can find you online if they want to follow up with you on questions or follow up with your games. Daniel, do you want to go first? Where can people find you and check out your stuff?
Well, mine's easy. Just search for Storyteller and you will find my Twitter and all my personal accounts and my email. So everything is there out there, easy to reach.
All right, cool. And Richard, where can folks find you?
You can find me on my website, richarddansky.com.
Excellent. And Latoya, how about you?
So we have our site, glowup.games. You can find us on the unfortunately depreciating hell site that was Twitter. I'm still there at Latoya Peterson. Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. You can just look around. I'll be there.
Awesome. And yeah, if anybody wants to, you can find me at Richard Rouse III on Twitter. I do still reply there, but a lot slower than in the past. And also you can check out stuff at paranoidproductions.com or at farbridge.com for some of the bigger games I'm working on. And this has been great. I want to thank everybody for coming, and thanks everyone at LudoNarraCon. Oh, and speaking of LudoNarraCon, Church in the Darkness is at LudoNarraCon, so on sale. So check that out too. Hope you enjoy it. And thanks everybody for coming. And thanks to Daniel, Richard, and Latoya.